it's recording.
Are we starting now?
Yeah, we're going to start now, Joe.
All right, good.
All right. Good evening and welcome to the third podcast of the second season of The Moral Economy. I am one of your hosts, Andrew.
I am another one of your hosts, Chell.
And I'm the third host, Nawaz.
And I'm your last host, Frat.
Today we're going to start off with Chell's argument for why you shouldn't vote.
That's right. Do I just jump right in?
Yeah, just jump right in. Yeah.
All right, cool. Here we go. Then, so I'm going to try to convince you today not to vote. But I have a quick disclaimer here at the beginning. First off, I'm only talking about the U.S. political process. And I know that this is kind of a controversial topic. And so, quick sort of disclaimer. The disclaimer is vote for Sanders. Or not, whatever you want. But the point is that I'm not advocating political apathy. This is in no way supposed to be some sort of argument for political apathy. Instead, I'm trying to point to what I believe are a number of very legitimate criticisms of the U.S. political process. And as you will see in the end, I'm actually advocating the opposite of political apathy, namely greater political participation.
Cool.
So cool. So to do sort of a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to go through first three sort of common reasons why people talk about why you shouldn't vote, and then I'm going to I'll also give my own argument, an additional reason, and then I'm going to address a few common responses that I hear where people argue that I should vote. So yes, okay, good. Let's jump right in. So common reasons given not to vote. The first reason is that voting is irrational. You see this in the public choice literature and economic papers and stuff. The crux of the issue is that the power of any individual vote to influence the outcome of the U.S. Any U.S. election is approaching zero. So if you vote, an individual vote has almost a zero chance of actually changing the outcome of the election. In fact, you're more likely to get into a car accident and die on your way to the polls than you are to influence the outcome of the election in any substantial way.
So don't vote.
So yes, good. Now you might say, okay, maybe that's the case because there are 300 million Americans, and my God, I mean, if we all voted, of course, any given vote would have very little power, very little influence. But I want to say that that's not the case. It's particular to the American style of democracy. So we have indirect elections with electoral colleges. It's first past the post, winner takes all, two-party system, which in my opinion is just literally millimeters away from some kind of totalitarian regime. And I would propose looking at proportional representation systems. In a proportional representation system, it doesn't matter if there's 300 million voters. If just 5% of those voters select some crazy fringe party, then that fringe party will get 5% of the seats in Parliament. Yeah, so that means that maximizes the power of any individual vote. Whereas I believe that the United States, the U.S. system, has been developed to minimize the power of any particular vote. Good. So that's the first reason voting is irrational. The second reason, both parties are the same. You hear this all the time. A great example, Romney recently came out and said that he was basically the Obamacare that is this highly controversial. Obamacare is highly controversial. Romney basically said, it's my legislation. I'm a Republican, and in Massachusetts, I tried to pass the same legislation, And so it's funny because if Romney had won if McCain had won the election, he probably would have passed healthcare reform, and it probably would have looked exactly like Obamacare. And in this case, all of the Democrats would have hated it, and all of the Republicans would have loved it. But because a Democrat was president when the healthcare reform was passed, all the Republicans hate it, and all the Democrats love it. So both of the parties are the same. Additionally, both parties are complicit in the corporate takeover of America. We have these super PACs, campaign donations. We've been changing these and reforming these over and over again. We've basically handed the power to the corporations in the United States. And this is not just a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. This is a bipartisan thing going on here. So the political establishment is complicit in the corporate takeover of America. That's the second reason. The third reason that you commonly hear is that, and this kind of goes back a little bit to what we talked about on the last podcast with Chomsky's propaganda model. But it's impossible, or nearly impossible, in the United States to be an informed voter. And this has to do with the collusion between the White House and the mainstream media. This collusion excludes relevant information from the political discourse. A really interesting example is this whole controversy with the NSA, which came out in what, like 2008, maybe 2011, even? Yeah, but it was already in 1988 that widespread international surveillance became popular. I have it written down.
Under
1988, man.
1988, was it still under Reagan?
I
Or
guess it would have been, yeah.
Yeah, it was under Reagan then.
Yeah, and you know, I had a friend in university. This would have been in about 2004, and he was a big conspiracy theorist. He spent way too much time just reading conspiracy theories online, and he talked all the time about how the government had written algorithms to read our emails, to listen to our phone calls, how they were basically surveilling the entire world. And everybody at the time thought that he was just a crazy conspiracy theorist. 7 years later, it turns out that everything that he was talking about was pretty much exactly the case. Yeah, and the reason why we didn't hear about this before is because it was not deemed newsworthy by the powers that be. You know, nobody said, "Oh, let's talk about echelon and worldwide surveillance and this crazy stuff." They let that be the realm of conspiracy theorists, and the mainstream media focused on other events. So, but at the same time, during this whole period of time, civil liberties and privacy was being eroded in the United States, and we voted for the people who were making those decisions, but we had no way to know that those were the kinds of decisions they were making because this issue was completely neglected in the media. Yeah. So
if I can just bring in when we went to Utrecht for the conference, we talked to Nancy Hollander, and she pointed out that when a case is brought before the court, the United States can say, "Oh no, that's secret documents. We're not allowed to, or we can't defend it, so the case will be thrown out."
Yeah, exactly. But so how are you supposed to make an informed choice if you can't get access to the information? If we don't know what's happening in Washington, then how are we expected to make the correct choice when we're voting for representatives? So good. So those are the three commonly heard arguments against voting. Yeah, that your vote doesn't matter, it's irrational, both parties are essentially the same, and it's impossible to be an informed voter. So now I'd like to turn towards my own argument. And my argument is that the voting mechanism itself has been hijacked by the political class in the United States to legitimize otherwise non-democratic policy decisions. And I came to this insight after reading a paper called Testing Theories of American Politics, Elites, Interest Groups, and Average Citizens by Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page. It was published or written, I think it was with Princeton and Northwestern, and it was published in 2014. And in this paper, the authors point to the fact that in cases where the wealthy or powerful people in the United States had one policy choice and the majority of Americans wanted something else, in these cases, the elites got what they wanted something like 75% of the time. So the conclusion of this paper is that America is not a democracy, but rather an oligarchy. So yeah, let's talk about that for a second. So in short, the political process in the United States has evolved such that a small group of powerful people can pursue policy objectives against the interests of the majority. Now, we have a name for that. We have a name, besides oligarchy, we have a name for any kind of political association where a small group of political elites can pursue their own interests, even when those interests conflict with the majority of the people. And we call this an autocracy. Yeah? And so, yes. Autocracies characteristically use certain methods to control dissent. Yeah, they either use violence or they use propaganda, amongst other methods. You know, violence is pretty obvious. You know, if you're a dissenter, the autocracy, they arrest you, they do bodily harm to you, they kill you, whatever you want. Propaganda is designed to convince people that there actually is nothing to dissent about at all. Yeah, there's that quote. Was it Zizek who said that the difference between Soviet propaganda and capitalist propaganda is that the capitalists believe their propaganda, whereas the Soviets, was it Zizek that said that?
I don't remember. That.
Sounds like him.
Okay,
Yeah.
I can't remember
Sounds like something
who
he
said
would
it.
say.
It may have been Chomsky too. I'm not sure, but anyway,
They're the same people.
Yeah,
Basically.
yeah. But the difference between socialist, Soviet propaganda, nobody believed the Soviet propaganda. They all knew that they were being lied to. But in the United States and other democracies and capitalist societies, we totally drink that Kool-Aid, I believe is the expression, or it was back in the day. So propaganda is used to subvert political potential dissent by misrepresenting the facts. The best propaganda is, of course, propaganda that people both believe and internalize. Yeah? My argument is that voting as a mechanism in the United States is exactly this kind of propaganda. Yeah? Basically, the political establishment continues this narrative whereby they convince the people that this is a democracy, one person, one vote. You have the power to influence politics, to influence your world in a substantial way. And people believe that because it's a democracy and we vote. Yeah, and that's part of what a democracy is. Yeah. However, at the same time, the political establishment, regardless of who's elected or how many people vote or any of that, they pursue policy objectives that benefit a certain small group of people in the United States. Yeah, and they use the voting as a way of sustaining this system. Yeah, they say, oh, but you can vote. We live in a democracy. Yeah, it's kind of a sort of propaganda. Yes, good. So, I hope that was kind of clear. So, if we continue to vote, it only reinforces, perpetuates, and entrenches this situation. It signals to the power that be that the situation is acceptable. That we, as citizens of the United States, are happy with the situation where we vote, and then the political establishment does whatever the hell they want. Yeah, good. And I think that is a highly unacceptable way of doing democracy, of course. Yeah, because in a democracy, it should be the case that if the majority of the people want something, then that should be the thing that happens, that takes place. Yeah. And to manipulate us in this way is extremely unacceptable. And if you vote, then you are giving some sort of tacit or implicit agreement to this kind of manipulation. You're saying, I agree with this. This system is okay. And I think you shouldn't do that. So don't vote. Those are my arguments. Quickly. Good. So some common responses. I hear these all the time. So first off, people say, but Chell, it's your civic duty to vote. You have to vote. Go out and vote. Like that's your responsibility as a member of a democracy, a citizen of a democracy. But I think that is just a terrible way to think about things. So my civic duty is to vote. It kind of makes it sound like then I don't have to do anything else. As long as I go out and fill out those bubbles, fill in those little bubbles in that sheet and drop it in the ballot box, then I have accomplished my civic responsibility and I can ignore it until the next election 2 years later or whenever it happens. Yeah, and that I don't have any kind of ongoing responsibility to engage in my democracy. All I have to do, fill out the bubbles, drop it in the ballot box, done. Yeah, I think that this idea of a civic duty, especially with regards to voting, it actually undermines American democracy more than it helps it, I guess. Second, symbolic voting. People say, well, Chell, if you don't like any of the candidates and you think that they're all the same party and it's all crap anyway, then just vote for a third party or vote for D's nuts or something. That's the, you can signal to the establishment that you're unhappy with the system by voting for something else, and I'm sympathetic to this argument. But on the other hand, I think this goes back to what I was saying, that if just by voting, even voting for D's nuts, you're nevertheless, in a sense, confirming a system where voting is used as propaganda in order to manipulate the electorate into a situation where they're happy with outcomes that do not benefit them. Yeah. And finally, I hear this very often, that we have to stop the other guy from getting into the White House. So if you are a Democrat, then you got to vote for whoever they put forward because Trump is an asshole. And if you are a Republican, then you can't let Hillary win because she's a woman. I don't know.
Or God forbid, the socialist, right?
Or God forbid the socialist, Bernie Sanders. Like they'll just ruin the country. So you have to not let the other guy in. So it's a choice between two evils. And you have to choose the lesser of two evils. Yeah, I think that's crap, and I think that's crap because first off, very superficially, I don't want any evil person to represent me. Why would I choose evil? Like it's the lesser of two evils, but it's still evil? Okay. Superficially, but not superficially. And I want to bring up an analogy. And I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast. And I was kind of inspired by Eddie's story of trying to buy shoes or something. He wanted to buy shoes. Eddie said he wanted to buy shoes about that had not been made with slave labor, child labor. So poor abused children chained to some sort of shoe factory thing all day long. And and he said to the storekeeper, he said, are there any of the shoes here not made with child labor?
No, but
and
he said nobody would guarantee every time we would go to a shop.
Well, this is just an analogy, so it's not exactly Eddie's story, but okay. So the analogy is you walk into a shoe store and you say to the shopkeeper, "Hey, I want to buy a pair of shoes, but I really want to buy a pair of shoes that was not made with slave labor or child labor." And the shopkeeper says, "I'm sorry, but I cannot guarantee that any shoes that we sell here are not made with child labor." So now you have a choice. You either do what? Buy the shoes or don't buy the shoes. Yeah? So, what choice would you make? Well, I guess I'll buy the shoes. I guess it's more evil for me to be barefoot. So I guess I'll just buy the shoes, even though by buying the shoes, I am endorsing a system where shoes are produced by abused children working 16 hours a day, chained to some factory line, assembly line thing. So the clear answer is you don't buy the shoes. If you really care, you don't buy the shoes. Yeah. So anyway, lesser of two evils argument, I think, does not hold water. And So to sum up, there are 4 reasons not to vote in the United States. First off, it's irrational to vote. Your vote has 0% chance of influencing the outcome of the election, given the way that our system is structured. So what's the point? You might die in a car. You might die in a car accident on your way to the polls. It's much more rational to stay home. Second, both parties are the same. They both are complicit in the corporate takeover of America. Voting for the Democrats is just as bad as voting for the Republicans, so who cares? Finally, it's impossible, thirdly, it's impossible to be an informed voter because of the collusion between the White House and mainstream media. And then my argument that voting as a mechanism has been hijacked by a political class to legitimize otherwise non-democratic policy decisions. That's the overview. And finally, in conclusion, why am I saying this? Well, I'm saying this because I think that we have a responsibility as citizens in a democracy to be politically active. Yeah, and I think that voting is the smallest part of that political activity, and also, in a sense, the least important. If you want to be a good citizen in a democracy, a good democratic citizen, you should go and engage in politics. You should talk to people. You should join grassroots political movements. You should discuss and debate and engage with politicians and with representatives and start a podcast and do exactly what we're doing here. I know that we don't have a huge audience. Hopefully that changes. But nevertheless, this is an example of real political activity. Going to the ballots and filling in a couple bubbles and dropping it in and washing your hands of the entire situation is the opposite of democratic engagement. And that is my argument. I do have I do have sources for almost all the things that I said. Almost all the things I said have sources, which we'll put in the doodly-doo in the Facebook.
In the presentation, in the video.
We'll put them online.
I believe it's called the doodly-doo.
It's the website.
Yes, it's the website. It's called the doodly-doo.
Yeah.
But that was a reference to some other YouTuber. I watch one too many YouTubers. All right, then so that's it. That's all I have to say about that. So don't vote, or do, and if you do, vote for Sanders.
All right, cool, man. Thanks for that.
Yeah,
that totally sounds like political propaganda to me. Like that.
All right, so as many of you in the United States know, it's Black History Month. So my bit is going to be about that. And it's called Black History Matters. I remember a scene in Mel Gibson's historical clusterfuck, The Patriot. Just before the climax battle, a white bigoted yokel turns to a black man, a slave forced by his master to fight for the rebel cause with the promise to be set free, a man to whom the yokel had been racially antagonistic through and through, and says, "I am proud to fight alongside you," or some bull like that. I don't remember what the black man said, except that it was something heartwarming. But if he had said, "I'm doing this for my freedom, not for racist pricks like you," wouldn't it have been a better message? No, because white men, and yes, I am one of them, need the security of perpetually latent forgiveness. Isn't that the point of their racism? To help black people act more like Jesus? Saving their souls is the least we can do for 246 years of chattel enslavement, for giving us hundreds of years of unprecedented economic growth, to catch up and surpass the rest of the world in the Industrial Revolution so that we can live the American dream. Unintentionally, Mel Gibson painted an exemplary picture of what is called the white narrative. 246 years of slavery. 150 years of segregation. Don't give me any segregation has ended bull. I have 2 words for you. Flint, Michigan. And do you think slavery has ended? 3 words. Prison industrial complex. 396 years of slavery and segregation. What am I getting at here? The narrative of the American white male is that slavery and segregation have ended, and indeed it is precisely because decent white men have, throughout our history, taken up the black person's cause that we have come so far today. There is in fact some truth to this, as in, it is precisely because white people believe this mythological narrative that we have come this far, which is not very far at all. Here is a completely out of context list of US presidents who owned slaves. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, James Polk, Zachary Taylor, Andrew Johnson, and Ulysses S. Grant. Indeed, 49% of the Founding Fathers owned slaves. To give a taste of the white narrative on slavery and the Founding Fathers, let me quote a few passages from the revolutionarywar.net. Ahem. Quote, George Washington wrote to a friend and said, I can only say there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery. Isn't that heartwarming? Quote, Yet Washington owned slaves his entire life, beginning at age 11 with the death of his father until his own death. The website presents a few more examples of the hypocrisy of the Founding Fathers' behaviors, then implores our understanding. Quote, Before we judge too harshly, we must understand that slavery was established long before the Revolutionary War. For centuries, slavery had been a growing part of the economy worldwide, not just in the colonies. Some believe that since slavery was so commonplace, growing a conscience about it might easily not have happened at all. They suggest that the fact that they oppose slavery at all is incredibly radical for their time. What do you guys think? Radical? Before we judge too harshly, I want you right now to replace slavery with child fucking. George Washington goes, I can only say there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of child fucking. And the website is like, Washington fucked children his entire life. Before we judge too harshly, we must understand that child fucking was established long before the Revolutionary War. Some believe that since child fucking was so commonplace, growing a conscience about it might easily not have happened at all. They suggest that the fact that they opposed child fucking at all is incredibly radical for their time. Is this concept too difficult to understand? Having a bad conscience and not acting on your bad conscience does not free you from the moral culpability. In many ways it's worse, for it creates a culture of excuse. I personally think this passage from the website is more indicative of the reasons the Founding Fathers had slaves. Quote, Patrick Henry, who is most famous for his quote, "Give me liberty or give me death," wrote in a letter, "I am drawn along by the general inconvenience of living without them. I cannot justify it, however culpable my conduct." Inconvenience. Is that where we are today? We talk about the Founding Fathers' concerns about inconvenience instead of detailing the horrors of slavery. How inconvenient was it for the slaves who had to wait on their masters hand and foot, who were whipped into submission for lagging in their work, who were raped, likely before any age of consent, not that a slave can ever give consent. Yes, Patrick Henry admits his culpability, but remember that this does not somehow make him less culpable. And the website carefully cherry-picks from 9 slaving Founding Fathers who happened to express opinions about slavery that weren't outright satanic, saying, quote, they themselves were aware of the duplicity of their behavior. And for those who don't know, duplicity is a fancy-smancy term for hypocrisy. As a philosopher, I do feel compelled to talk about logical fallacies. And I think nowhere are logical fallacies so prevalent than in white conversations about race. Besides some obvious logical fallacies on the part of whites, such as the false equivalency, see, a black man killed a cop, it happens on both sides, or the false equivalency of pointing out that white people have hardships too, whenever white privilege is mentioned, or whatever the fuck fallacy it is that makes white people say, oh, but slaves were fed and housed, their owners had a vested interest in taking care of them. As bad as those are, there are some deeper, more insidious fallacies flying around. And these are what I call the all lives matter fallacies. In short, the fallacy of saying whatever black people say is wrong. Actually, as a philosopher, I feel sickened by the whitewashing of the discipline. In my research on racism and fallacies, I came across a piece by worldcrass.com entitled Black Lives Matter, 3 words, 12 logical fallacies. Yes to black lives, no to sophistry, slander. To set the tone, I'll point out that only 11 logical fallacies are mentioned. First, the website has this to say about the abusive fallacy and Black Lives Matter. The obvious meaning of Black Lives Matter is, you are a racist. After the shooting of Eric Garner and Michael Brown, the relevant question is whether black people are arrested or killed by the police in numbers out of proportion with the need for arrest/use of force. The slogan presupposes there is general agreement on the answer to this and delivers an ad hominem attack at anyone who is suspected of disagreeing with consensus. The abusive fallacy is a subtype of ad hominem when it turns into verbal abuse of the opponent rather than arguing about the originally proposed argument. The slogan presupposes there is general agreement on the answer to this. Whether there is a general agreement is not in question. In fact, precisely because it is demonstrably true, and people still go around saying the slogan presupposes there is a general agreement on the answer to this, is the exact point of Black Lives Matter. Raising this point is then not verbal abuse, but actually raising a point. Next, an appeal to fear. A specific type, a specific type of appeal to emotion where an argument is made by increasing fear and prejudice towards the opposing side. Ta-Nehisi Coates' letter to his son illustrates this nicely. Unquote. Talking about being afraid is not an appeal to fear. Coates writes how he and all the black people he knew were afraid their entire lives, how they lived with fear, how they dealt with it. That fear had a very real source, founded deep within the social fabric and legacy of the United States. Pointing out that you are afraid and that there are specific people whom you fear is not being prejudiced towards those people, or indeed to anyone. That you, as a white person, feel pointing this out as prejudice against you once again supports the point of pointing it out. This goes as well for the appeal to spite. A specific type of appeal to emotion where an argument is made through exploiting people's bitterness or spite towards an opposing party. The Baltimore rioting suggests that this fallacy lurks behind the Black Lives Matter campaign. There is no spite. Black Lives Matter may express bitterness, as there is good reason to be bitter, but it's not to exploit. And actually, I have a lot more, but I for the reason of time, want to move on. One, I think, very important fallacy that they talk about, this website talks about, is converse accidents, which, quote, it occurs in a statistical syllogism when an exception to a generalization is wrongly excluded and the generalization wrongly called for as applying to all cases. That is, it starts with a 1 or 2 examples that is unusual or atypical, the Garner and Brown deaths, and then errs by deriving from these cases the truth of general principle. And here I want to point out some statistics. In 2015, a total of 11,040 people were killed by cops. 303 of those were black. 478 were white. That means per million, 7.5 were black and 2.92 were white. Of the killings, unarmed black men were killed. 75 unarmed black men were killed versus 102. 38 black men with knives were killed as opposed to 70 white. And 139 black men with firearms were killed as opposed to 305. Now consider that black people are 13.2% of the US population and whites make up 62.6%. Yet 26.6% of people shot by police are black and 50.7% are white. 33.5% black versus 45% white are unarmed. 24.5% black versus 45.2% white carried knives. 25.1% versus 51% carry firearms. And the argument that the homicide rate is higher among blacks and white doesn't add up. How does that explain why unarmed blacks are more likely to be killed by police? Or address why black-on-black homicide is much less investigated than other forms of homicide? In other words, black people are killed by police at twice the rate that would otherwise be expected given the population. Is that an accident? And I'm going to keep on moving on because we're running out on time. Last two fallacies. The first is the fallacy of the single cause. Quote, "It is assumed that there is one simple cause of an outcome. Racism leads to the deaths of Brown and Gardner, when in reality it may have been caused by a number of only jointly sufficient causes." And then the furtive fallacy, which, quote, "Outcomes are asserted to have been caused by the malfeasance of decision makers." These last two, I just don't know how they are to be derived from the three words Black Lives Matter. In fact, none of these fallacies can be derived from those words. One has to be bringing in one's own assumptions, and it's quite clear here that the assumptions made have not been scrutinized. It can be none other than an appeal to motive fallacy, assuming that the motive of people shouting Black Lives Matter is to discredit and defame other people. In fact, to nerd it up a bit, this whole piece is what the webcomic Existential Comics calls the fallacy. Listing a bunch of fallacies and their definitions as a way of arguing against something is not, in fact, a valid form of argumentation. It is merely misleading, dishonest, and a fallacious appeal to logic in order to discredit something that likely makes you uncomfortable. And remember, even if the Black Lives Matter movement arguments were fallacious, that doesn't mean their conclusions are wrong. You have to make an argument for why their conclusions are wrong, whether their arguments themselves hold up. And finally, I'm going to go on to the last bit. My point here is, if you do not know the history of blacks, beyond that they originally came from Africa, were officially slaves for some period of time until a heroic white man in the White House set them free, were officially segregated for another period of time until a heroic white man in the White House signed a paper, and now they have someone in the White House, then you are contributing to systemic racism. If all you do when you hear Black Lives Matter is spit and throw out logical fallacies instead of sitting down and listening to their plight, then you are contributing to systemic racism. If when black people say they fear for their bodies, and all you have to say is that they are fear-mongering, then you are contributing to systemic racism. I didn't get to it, but if you can't see that Islamophobia and racism often come hand in hand, as shown by the birther movement, then you are contributing to racism. If you can't see why, we first have to learn black history in order to catch up to hundreds of years of intentional ignorance and blatant lies, so that we can see that black history is not just history about and for black people, but all of our history, then you are contributing to systemic racism. And if you are contributing to systemic racism, even if you don't want to, and you don't even want to learn black history, well, maybe we won't believe that you aren't racist. That's all.
Thank you for that, Andrew.
Yeah.
How should we do the discussion now?
I'd like to go to Chels first, because I had a few things to say. One was really good.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm really surprised, Chel.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's good.
I wanted to, I've always thought, this economic argument that you made, right? Which is what the economists make. For me, it's kind of bullshit anyway. I mean, like, it's not.
I agree.
Yeah, you agree. But also, it's for me, like, isn't that the reason that we should have more direct democracy or more local democracy to increase your chance of actually causing effect in the world?
Totally. Well, I mean, of course, I'm definitely for small scale local democracy. But if that's out of reach at the moment, at least some kind of proportional representation.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't make sense that it's possible in the United States that 51% of the people want one president, and 49% of the people want another president, and the 49% win because of weird procedural stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, that actually brings up another point that I think that Howard Zinn made in the People's History of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And he looked at, elections and pointed out very rightly, only 40% of eligible voters actually go to vote.
Yeah.
I think it's increased lately, for Obama, it increased drastically.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, for the last one, for Clinton and Bob Dole,
Okay.
Back in the day, 1996, it was the lowest it had ever been. I think it was like 36%. And yet they were still, able to legitimize the system.
Yeah.
So, like, to what degree do we have to not vote until, it's not legitimized, is my question.
Yeah, I guess, if we all stop voting, then we'll have to rethink the way that we go about doing politics.
Yeah, well, here's exactly what I think. I think they're just going to legitimize anyway, and so you made the lesser of two evils argument, and I agree that's a bad sort of argument to make. On the other hand, there are some things that we know if Bernie Sanders got in that would just be much better than it versus Trump.
I mean, Bernie Sanders himself says that it doesn't matter who wins the presidential election. That no one man has the power to change the system in the way it needs to be changed, and that we need a grassroots political movement to do that.
Yeah, we need both, though. That's what
exactly. I mean, if I felt okay. I mean, the U.S. system, with the Electoral College and the whole idea of swing states and stuff. If you don't live in a swing state, then you could vote for the other guy, and it wouldn't matter. It literally would not matter. You could not vote. You could vote for somebody else. You could vote for the guy you don't want to win. And if you don't live in a swing state, the state is just going to go the way that it goes. And that is a huge disincentive to vote. If you compare that to a proportional system, then if just 5% of the people in the state want one thing, then that thing will get heard. That thing will be then institutionalized, put into the political institution. Say even if it's a crazy right-wing party or a crazy left-wing party, they would still get some kind of representation. And I think that the two-party system, especially the way that we've set it up, is no longer capable of representing the American people. I mean, maybe it was an efficient way to go about things a long time ago when we had to take horses to get around and we didn't have any radios or internet. But now that we have all this stuff and it's really easy to literally count the number of votes. And I say, why don't we just count the number of votes? I mean, if we're going to keep up with the two-party system, then let's at least count the number of votes.
Well, then, I agree with your arguments mostly, but I'd make an amendment, if you're going to choose between voting and just not being politically engaged or being politically engaged, then choose the fucking political engagement, right? Actually go out, do stuff, get things done, and forget voting. Yeah. But, my fear, like you say you're not for apathy, but my fear is, of course, that, same people who don't vote are also just going to be apathetic as well.
But I mean...
Except for the anarchists, which I love you guys.
I mean, I think that part of the political apathy in the United States has to do with this feeling of alienation, this feeling of helplessness in the face of a system that is structured in such a way that any individual vote is minimized. The power of any individual vote is minimized. And of course you would feel apathetic. Because you look at it and you say, I can't do anything. It doesn't matter if I vote. Literally, it doesn't matter. In my state, that's not a swing state, if I vote one way or if I vote the other way, has zero influence, zero impact. And so of course you would be apathetic. Because what's the point of voting? If we changed the structure of the system in a way, if we made it, for example, proportional, then maybe that would motivate people to vote because they would feel like my vote actually carries with it some weight. All I need is a small group of people to agree with me, and suddenly we get something. We can see that effect. I mean, and that's not even to mention the whole, primary process where we all try really hard for some guy, and then this establishment says, and we choose this guy. I mean, half of those primaries, it doesn't even matter what the people choose. After the people, it's just to test the waters. What do the people want? And then we take that into consideration when assigning delegates. I mean, come on.
Yeah, but that somehow empowers the parties a lot in eventually deciding who their presidential candidate it's going to be. So you make a good point, but I would still somehow think of this whole rigging of the political system as I put it, the way you put it, that there's the system is rigged in a way by corporate interests, by the media, by both the parties, that the political scoring points are not very far away from each other. And that way, as a voter, I would feel that really if I'm not the one who's deciding or who's casting a decisive vote in any way, which public choice literature tells us that the likelihood of that is close to zero.
Well, it's never actually happened in the history of the United States. There's never been a case where one vote has been the deciding vote.
Yeah, but that's again, you mentioned that's how the system is set up. Yeah. So,
but I think there has been a case where one delegate has been.
Perhaps for like a primary or something, sure.
Yeah, but again, my point was this whole reduction of democracy to the process of voting. People think that voting is the actual essence of democracy, which is really not true. It's just another.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all generally agree at this table. You can go be engaged democratically, and it doesn't mean you're always going to people and taking votes or stuff. Like we all go to a club and make what's called a foku, a people's kitchen, a soup kitchen basically, and it's not much effort, and we see that we at least affect some people's lives. Chell does urban gardening. We do this podcast. Frat probably does stuff. No, Frat is very politically engaged. In Hamburg,
and this is political engagement. This is democratic engagement. These are examples of democratic engagement.
Stand for something that is close to you. So something that you should change in the world. Should sort of be the change in the world.
It should be your life. I mean, because it becomes your life, or it is your life actually. I mean, whether you want it or not, it is your life. And if you start thinking about, well, I can actually engage in my life and in politics at the same time, well then, it doesn't sound so difficult.
Yeah. I mean, there's this huge rhetoric in the United States. You see it all the time. Get out and make your vote count. Professors remind their students, go out and vote. Don't forget to vote. And it really has this reductionist feeling to it. Like that's what it is to live in a democracy. Go out and vote. And this rhetoric supports a system where we're all voting. Well, okay, 40% of us are voting, but it doesn't matter the outcome of that vote because once the people have been elected and they have taken office, they will just do whatever the hell they want.
They always tack towards the center.
Well, they don't even tack towards the center. They tack towards a small group of political elites in the United States.
Yeah.
And rhetoric follows when you bring this up, and the answer from the other camp is that, well, you can unvote them out of their office in the next elections, right? You can take them out of the office, bring them down in the next elections.
Yeah.
But that devalues the 4 or 5 years of your life, basically, right?
Yeah.
And I think this stems from our basic conception of democracy, which you guys have rightfully argued against, which is based on Athenian democracy. And the main problem with the Athenian democracy was that it was based on slavery.
Yeah.
Bringing you guys' presentations together,
it was
they are actually
male landowners.
very indispensably linked to each other.
Yeah.
Aristotle, a philosopher that we all admire and like speaking about, used to think of slaves as talking tools.
Yeah. And he also had sex with children, so that's fine.
Well, that brings it into my child fucking,
But still, within the Athenian, I mean, another good point is that within the Athenian demos, there was eventually later when Athens, why Athens is so followed is because Athens survived the wars because of this sort of unique political system that it had.
Oh, actually, I'm going to point out that the part of Athenian democracy was actually a lottery. That you didn't vote for certain offices. You had a lottery and people had to fulfill those, like a jury, and people had to fulfill it, and it had a very good, effect of not corruptible, for instance. So
that's true, but again, it was the sort of democracy that we might want to see in the world. It was direct. People would go. People from every day. I mean, people, of course, of a certain standard. Slave owners, males with properties, all that kind of stuff. There was this. criteria that you had to fulfill to be able to go to the parliament and debate it out over there. So that was the thing. So people could directly go in and talk and hear them make their point out, and then this could be put to vote, could be put to a lottery, as you said. But the point that I somehow wanted to make was that eventually Athens also had a procedure of excommunication. There was eventually this risk that you would lose your citizenship rights if you did not agree to the virtues of the city-state. And this is something that, is a threat, which even today does not exist. Today a membership in a democracy, in a nation-state, is something that's absolutely involuntary, right? You have no say over what country you're born in. You're just born in there. And then you have to be a part of the political system. And if you're, say, an American, you really don't have a lot of chance to change the political system in that sense. But in Athens, at least, to be fair to them, you had this chance. If you were of a certain station in the society, you could go and at least, tell the people what you want. But unfortunately, we're even denied that in that sense,
I mean, talking about change is really interesting because, look at how the political system in the United States has changed over time. Certain things are still around, like the Electoral College and our indirect approach to democracy. But other things have changed, like campaign funding and super PACs. And the things that have changed are the kinds of things that are for the benefit of a small group of people. And the things that would actually deliver democracy back into the hands of the people have remained the same and are super, what's the word, atavistic or whatever, super old-fashioned and outmoded. Is that a word?
Yeah, outmoded. Anachronistic.
Yeah. Anachronistic. Yeah, yeah, and yeah. But those things help people obsolete. Those things, but those anachronistic, obsolete mechanisms, they help the political elites maintain their power base. And anything that changes are also things that help the political elites maintain their power base, like campaign funding and super PACs and all this kind of stuff. And corporations are people, and all of these are the kinds of changes, and that's and that has a lot to do with everything that we're talking about. For example, the idea that we can't be informed voters, or in the Athenian democracy, when you were voting about issues. If you were eligible to sit in their what's it called? The name of it.
Parliament? I don't
know.
know.
It was like a forum, but it was a thing that had a name for it.
It was probably a forum.
Yeah. Well, if you were eligible to vote in Athenian democracy, you actually sat there and you listened to the kinds of decisions. But those kinds of decisions, the same decisions, and I mean this is just the case with representative systems, but those kind of decisions are made behind closed doors, out of the face of public. Yeah, and we say, of course, we have to do it that way because if every 300 million Americans could, say something about these decisions, we'd never make a decision. Yeah, but so we need a representation system so that we can do it. But behind those closed doors, they're making decisions like, oh, I got an idea. Let's make campaign funding really easy. Let's make corporations be able to give unlimited funding, and we'll just undermine the entire political system with these decisions we're making behind closed doors. So we have literally no access to the political decision-making process in the United States. And since we have no access, what the hell's the point of voting? Better do real democratic engagement. Better make community gardens and argue with people and join grassroots movements and protest and occupy and these kind of things. This is the only way that we're going to make our voice heard. Just voting is a joke in the United States. It's literally a joke. And it's a joke that's malicious and insidious because the political elites use the joke to legitimize their decisions. They say, well, you voted. You chose us. We represent you. You voted us into office, and these are the decisions we made. Even though those decisions that we made only benefit a small group of people. And the majority of people, if you polled them, would be like, no, I don't like this decision. Yeah.
But you sort of, you got to a very good point, and I was reminded of that as well. That in Athens, you could participate directly. But I was reading this book by Michael Sandel, and he makes this point that, on the paper, citizens can actually go to the Congress and participate in committee hearings. But what happens is, because there's these firms who sell these places to corporate lobbyists, and they make homeless people stand in the line way early before 8 o'clock in the morning. And these homeless people, because they're unfortunately homeless, they get up and stand in line for these corporate lobbyists, and these corporate lobbyists pay these firms to maintain, reserve places for them, so to
Yeah,
speak, in that sense.
And
And
there's a limited number of people who can go.
Exactly, that's
So
a
they
limited
fill
number
the
of
line,
people that can go to the...
and then at the last minute before they open the doors, they kick the they come
Yeah,
by and say,
yeah,
"Oh, you're
exactly.
holding my space, Mr.
Yeah,
Homeless guy.
yeah.
Well, here now I'll stand
Yeah,
here and
yeah.
go inside." And,
No, they pay for that.
Yeah,
They
here's
pay for
$5.
that.
Go get some
they pay
whiskey.
for that, and these firms who do this stuff, they think that this is a very legitimate business, and they do not. This is what the argument that Michael Sanders, this takes all the virtues of democratic participation from the society in the sense that if you're a committed Democrat citizen, whatever, you should be able to come early in the morning at 8 o'clock whenever the committee's hearing anything of interest. But because there's a homeless guy waiting there from 7 in the morning, he gets the space, but this homeless guy is going to sell the space to corporate lobbyists. So what happens is the corporate lobbyists get an access place to the committee's hearing where they can go and argue and defend their interests. But an ordinary citizen, which probably came at 8 o'clock, but because there were 30 people standing in line before him, he did not get access.
Yeah, and also, imagine an ordinary citizen actually gets in and wants to make an argument or a point, and they do, and they stand up, and people listen, but in the back of the heads of the politicians, in the back of their minds, they're thinking, well, this is just an ordinary citizen. Now, if this guy was representing, I don't know, Microsoft or Shell Oil or something, maybe I'll pay attention. But if this is just some John Doe from down the street, well, okay, that's a good point, guy, but it's not going to influence my decision-making because, you don't got the monies, friend. You didn't elect me. I was elected by this corporate, sort of strange corporate institution complex.
But that is also something interesting. Tell us about that. This institutionalization of money in American politics. It's very obvious now.
Yeah, well, that goes hand in hand.
It's too obvious.
Yeah, that's what I think. It's very obvious.
Yeah, everybody knows it. Yeah,
and still,
that's one reason Bernie Sanders is going so well. It's so obvious, and any Hillary Clinton is starting to sort of talk about it, and she's running into a lot of problems because obviously
it's one of the reasons Trump is doing so well.
Yeah,
because Trump didn't take any money. In fact, Trump's campaign
is completely self-funded.
Not even just self-funded. He spent hardly any money on it.
Yeah.
He's just really good at social media. But that's also one of his messages. He's saying, listen, corporations bought the White House, but I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to do what the corporations tell me because I'm going to fund it myself. So I don't belong to anybody.
In effect, biting the White House himself.
Totally. And so this is a bipartisan issue. Both sides of the aisle are very much interested in having a government that is not run by corporations. Well, the Republicans have Trump. And the Democrats have Sanders at the point.
Interesting then, of course, that Sanders does better against Trump than Hillary does in national polls.
Totally. Well, maybe, and it's a little bit crazy because median voter theorem in economics would just say that's impossible. But maybe, people on the right would be more likely to vote for Sanders than they would, of course, for Hillary because they just want something that changes business as usual.
Oh, because there are issues that speak to everyone, right? That's the whole point. And I want to I think I'd like to end this podcast now with a quote from Lucy Parsons. Never be deceived that the rich will permit you to vote away their wealth.
Yeah.
So,
and they won't.
Yeah.
But it's even worse because the rich will vote for more wealth. More wealth for the rich. Yeah.
All right.
So
before we close, I would like to make an announcement. We are going to have a big demonstration for those who are living in Hamburg. We are going to have a big demonstration this Saturday at 2 p.m. We are going to start at in front of Hauptbahnhof, Hachmannplatz. We are going to protest the war that is going on in Turkey against the Kurdish population and the massacres that the Turkish government has been committing over the last months, and the complete unaccountability on part of the Turkish government, who is being strongly supported by the US and EU, more prominently in German government rather than the EU countries in general. So I think everybody will be personally involved in this. Whoever is living in Hamburg, I think there is a responsibility to protest what is going on there, because it's basically your money that is supporting the killing of the innocent people there.
All right.
Cool.
Thank you for announcing that.
Good.
All right. So I guess we'll talk to you guys next week.
Talk to you next week. Maybe I want. I don't know if we'll be able. You can also cut this out at the end, but I was thinking if I can do another presentation, I would like to explain to you why Americans love guns so much, because I figured that out.
I look forward to it. So the next podcast will be partially about why Americans love guns, and so much, I think we'll do on arms as well.
Yeah, I'm also going to argue that we're all slaves, but that's just part of the gun thing. So
okay,
you'll see.
Well,
wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Awesome. See y'all next week.
When it's all